This is America's most inbred family, a total of 15 siblings that share the same parents who were first cousins. These are the Whitakers. Ray, one of the brothers, only communicates through barking and grunting.
I think only the monsters live. Only the monsters. Only the most psycho of psychos. Only the most evil dog-eat-dog people.
If you see another person that looks identical to you, run away and hide.
Throughout time, some brothers and sisters have taken their bond to a dark level, committing shocking crimes and leaving a trail of terror in their wake. From cases like the Menendez brothers that shocked the world, to disturbing crimes carried out by siblings you've probably never heard of, these are evil siblings in history you pray you never encounter. The Menendez brothers case is one of the most infamous crime cases of the 90s, and it's easy to see why. It's incredibly shocking and disturbing. It was receiving all this media attention at the time as one of the most notorious trials of the decade. Then the O.J. Simpson case came around and the Menendez brothers kind of faded out of the public eye. For those who are unfamiliar though, Lyle and Eric Menendez had a pretty privileged upbringing in Beverly Hills, but then they killed their parents. Of course, they denied this, saying that armed robbers were responsible, but authorities soon started getting suspicious of them after they started noticing all the fancy stuff the brothers were buying with their inheritance money they received from their late parents, which was quite sizable. Eventually, they confessed to having killed their parents, saying they'd wanted to escape their father's overly controlling behavior and high standards. In court, the defense argued that the brothers had suffered horrible mistreatment at the hands of their parents. The prosecution argued that this was pure fabrication and that they'd taken their parents' lives in order to receive their father's multi-million-dollar estate. It took 2 trials before the brothers were finally put to justice, receiving life imprisonment for their crimes. What you're seeing here is an interview with the Kray twins, 2 of England's most notorious criminals. You know, you're famous when Tom Hardy plays you in a biopic. But yeah, this is an actual interview with the gangsters just 2 years before they were incarcerated. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were notorious gangsters in London during the 50s and 60s. They ran a violent group known as The Firm, which operated in the East End of London. At the time, they were also successful nightclub owners, hosting celebrities like Judy Garland and Frank Sinatra. The Krays earned the nickname Britain's Godfathers, being involved in various criminal activities including extortion, armed robbery, arson, hijacking, you name it. They were known for their brutal tactics and worked together seamlessly, almost like they could read each other's minds during fights. In 1968, police finally arrested them for the killings of Jack the Hat McVitie and George Cornell. After their conviction, both brothers were sent to prison. Ronnie died from a heart attack in 1995, while Reggie passed away from cancer in 2000. In the early hours of June 30th, 2014 in Fresno, California, twin brothers Gerald and Jared Smith approached a 35-year-old woman. After asking her for money, she said she didn't have any, so they began ruthlessly attacking her. Then a 49-year-old homeless passerby named Nathan Halstead pulled over on his bike and tried to intervene. Instead of stopping, the twins just turned their aggression towards him. For several minutes, they attacked Halstead, leaving him unconscious on the ground. Then a driver approached the scene and attempted to help Halstead. In response, the Smith twins then targeted this driver as well, and amid all this chaos, a third vehicle came along, swerving to avoid Halstead's bike, but unfortunately ended up hitting Halstead, who was lying in the lane. The twins then fled the scene. The investigation led to the collection of fingerprints from a vehicle, which revealed that Gerald Smith had touched the hood during the altercation. Both twins were arrested shortly thereafter. They were convicted in 2019, but could potentially be released as early as 2026. On April 1st of 1990, the quiet town of South Dakota was shaken when an 85-year-old Walter Gibbs was found dead in his home. Now, at first it was thought he died of natural causes, but about a year later, authorities received a tip that turned the case on its head. Darlene Phillips, a 46-year-old woman serving time in prison, was reportedly bragging about having killed Gibbs, and this was not out of the realm of possibility. Darlene had a history with Gibbs. They'd been married and divorced twice, and just months before his death, She'd, tried to set his house on fire, so it wasn't like she was just bragging for the sake of it. Police would exhume Gibbs' body, and on closer inspection it looked like he had been killed. But Darlene's then husband, Jerome Phillips, eventually confessed to the crime. He said that he smothered Gibbs with a pillow while Darlene held down his legs, all while Darlene's twin sister, Dolores Christensen, was hanging out in the next room, knowing full well what was going on. And why was she cool with it? Well, it turned out Dolores was the beneficiary of Gibbs' will. Both sisters had actually been married to Gibbs at one point or another and had divorced him more than once, which is really weird. Imagine divorcing someone and then marrying an identical version of them. I mean, wouldn't you just want something new? And then doing it like twice over too. Very bizarre case. Anyway. On September 29th of 2001 in Penrose, Colorado, 24-year-old Joel Stovel was arrested for killing his neighbor's dog. Sheriff's Deputy Jason Schwartz responded to the call and placed Joel in the back of his police car. Joel's twin brother, Michael, was also arrested after making threats. Unfortunately, Michael had not been properly searched before being placed in the cruiser, and as they drove toward the police station, Michael freed himself with a pair of handcuff keys that he'd hidden in his pocket, pulled out a firearm, and shot at Deputy Schwartz. The twins fled to a nearby town where they had a rented trailer loaded with weapons and ammo. Two police officers arrived at the trailer, and then the twins started opening fire on the officers. One officer was left paralyzed after the confrontation. The brothers then stole a truck and led police on this high-speed chase. They kept firing at the pursuing officers while throwing stuff out of the back of the truck to slow them down. Eventually, the Stovel brothers ran over road spikes and encountered a police roadblock, but that still wasn't enough to stop them. They managed to escape into the nearby mountains. A massive manhunt was launched, but one day later, the twins ended up turning themselves in. One police officer was dead now, 18 others were injured. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Coming in at number 10 is the Jameson family. Bobby and Sherilyn and their daughter Madison lived in a small town with just over 500 people in Oklahoma. So when they went missing, over 100 people engaged in the search. Now the family's truck was found alongside the road, but there didn't appear to be signs of a struggle. Wallets and cell phones were found inside, as well as the family dog. Nothing was found until 4 years later when human remains were discovered. It would take another year for those remains to be confirmed to be the Jamesons. Now numerous theories have come up over the years, although nothing has been substantiated. Some theories include that the Jamesons had recently had a run-in with a white supremacist they kicked out of their home. Bobby had an ongoing feud with his father, who had mafia ties, and had taken out a restraining order against him. And then the strangest theory came from the local pastor. Apparently the family had gone to him prior to the disappearance, concerned about spirits entering their home. Bobby even asked the pastor for bullets capable of shooting spirits. Although it was thought to be a joke at the time, many people in the town, including Sherilyn's mother, firmly believed the Jamesons had gotten caught up with some kind of religious cult. Number 9. The McStay family. The McStays lived in California, where Joseph and Summer McStay raised their 2 sons. In 2010 though, the family drove off and they were never heard from again. It was unclear where exactly the family was headed, but police found that what documents do children need for traveling to Mexico was the last searched terms in the family's online history. Surveillance footage also seemed to indicate the McStays had crossed the US-Mexico border, though it was too grainy to ever actually confirm. But in 2013, it would be confirmed that they never made it to Mexico. The remains of the McStay family were found buried in a shallow grave near Victorville, California, with evidence of blunt trauma thought to be from a sledgehammer also buried with the family. Attention soon turned towards Joseph's former business partner, Chase Merritt. Cell phone records indicate that Joseph had tried to call Chase the day of the disappearance, but he didn't answer. Chase had also written checks under Joseph's name in the days following the vanishing. In 2014, Chase was arrested and charged with first-degree homicide, and in 2020 he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Number 8. The Martin family. Kenneth and Barbara Martin left their Oregon house on December 7th, 1958 with their 3 daughters, Virginia, Susan, and Barbie. They planned on going out to the country for a little bit to collect some holiday greenery to use for Christmas decorations, but they would never return home. The family was officially declared missing when Kenneth didn't show up to work. An investigation went underway, and it was clear that the Martins never returned home from their trip because nothing in the house was disturbed. 3 months after the family vanished, the bodies of Susan and Virginia were found in a river. But the remaining bodies, though, were never discovered. Several theories have come out about what happened. It has been theorized that Kenneth lost control of the vehicle and drove into the river. However, the car was also never found, so that seems unlikely. Number 7. The Godard family. In August 1999, Dr. Yves Godard and his son and daughter rented a sailboat near Normandy, France, and were never heard from again. Suspicions began when investigators realized the sailboat excursion was not planned. Godard told the man at the rental place that he was going on a quick fishing trip and told him they expected to return some days later. Now, on September 7th, 2 days after his scheduled return, a dinghy from the boat washed ashore with Goddard's checkbook and jacket. Investigators started to suspect something was wrong and checked the car he left in the rental's parking lot. There, they found significant traces of blood and morphine and moved to investigate his home, where they also found blood. The blood matched that of Goddard's wife, Marie France, who had not joined her family on the boat. After the blood was found in their home, a formal homicide investigation was opened. Nothing came out of the investigation, as Godard and his son and daughter were still missing. Then, in June 2000, fishermen dredged up his daughter's skull. 5 years later, Goddard's femur was found about 43 miles off the coast of northern France. The bodies of Marie France and his son have never been found, and investigators theorize Godard ended the life of his wife at their home and took his son and daughter on board the ship, which he planned to sink. Number 6. The Salomon family. Saul Salomon immigrated to the United States from Israel with his family. Saul ran a small business, and due to some savvy real estate investments, they made good money. They lived in Northridge for 10 years until their disappearance. The family owned a few exotic cars and had quite a bit of money. However, when police examined their home after their disappearance, nothing was stolen and it did not appear to be a robbery. The only potential clue was some blood splattered in one room and a piece of carpeting that had suspiciously been removed and covered up. Later, the family's passports would be discovered on the side of the highway. Suspects have arisen over the years. Some theories point to the Israeli mafia being involved, though relatives deny that the Salomons had any mafia ties. At one point, the police suspected Harvey Radar, a business associate of Saul's, but ultimately nothing could be proven.
Starting off our list today, we are talking about the House of Plantagenet. This was like a real-life version of Game of Thrones, ruling over England from the mid-12th to the late 15th centuries. These guys were at the center of the Wars of the Roses, a messy, bloody series of civil wars that were basically one giant family feud over who got to wear the crown. The family split into 2 main factions, the Yorks and the Lancasters. Think of them as the ultimate sibling rivalry, but instead of fighting over who gets the remote, they battled it out for the English throne. This internal family drama wasn't just a couple of minor skirmishes, it was a full-on warfare that threw England into chaos for decades. Castles were besieged, armies marched across the country, and battles left fields soaked in blood. Kings were made and unmade in battles like those at St. Albans, Towton, the bloodiest day in English history, and Bosworth, where Richard III famously lost his crown and his life to Henry Tudor, ending the Plantagenet rule and starting the Tudor dynasty. But the family were more than just their civil wars. They were a complicated bunch with a knack for political maneuvering, backstabbing, and dramatic public displays. They built some of England's most famous castles and were responsible for significant legal reforms. But let's be honest, they're mainly remembered for their spectacular fallouts and the way they turned sibling rivalry into a national sport. Their legacy is a story of power, betrayal, and the high cost of the throne, painting a vivid picture of medieval monarchy in all of its brutal glory. Next, we are talking about the Tarverdieva family. In Stavropol, Russia, there was a family that turned their lives into a real-life horror movie. Meet the Tarverdieva family, led by Inessa and her husband Roman, along with their daughters Victoria and Anastasia. This family wasn't just your average family next door. Over 6 years, starting as early as 2007, they embarked on a terrifying crime spree across the region. Inessa, a former nursery school teacher, and Roman, a dentist, led their family into a very dark world of crime, robbing, and eliminating anyone who got in their way. The family's method was chilling. They used camping trips as a cover to scout for their next victims, ranging from police officers to innocent travelers. Their most notorious crime was the brutal attack on the Chudakov family, where they mercilessly ended the lives of the family, taking trivial items while leaving more valuable assets untouched. This family of serial killers showcased a bizarre mix of domestic life and ruthless criminal activity, making them one of the most disturbing families in recent history. Their reign of terror ended in 2013 when they were finally captured, revealing a cache of weapons and stolen goods. Next, we are talking about the Kelly family. Back in 1887, the Kelly family ran a seemingly innocent inn in Kansas, a place that promised rest for cattle ranchers and travelers trekking across the dusty plains. Led by William Kelly along with his wife Kate, their son Bill, and daughter Kit, this family wasn't just serving up hospitality. They had a very sinister side that turned their homely inn into a deadly trap. The Kellys had a gruesome setup, a chair positioned over a trapdoor at their dining table. Unsuspecting guests who sat there would plummet through the floor, often to their deaths. If the fall didn't do the trick, members of the Kelly family would descend into the darkness to finish the job. But like all dark secrets, this one didn't stay hidden forever. After several travelers failed to reach their destinations, whispers and suspicions grew. When the Kelly family suddenly fled towards Mexico, the local authorities inspected the inn. What they found was the stuff of nightmares. Numerous bodies hidden beneath the house, in the stable, and near the barn, revealing the true horror of what went on at the inn. Legend has it that a furious posse caught up with the Kellys, and in a swift, brutal act of frontier justice, the family finally met their end. Next, we are talking about the Stafford Beck family. In the rugged and wild heartland of Kansas, there once lurked a family that could give any horror movie a run for its money. Led by the matriarch Nancy Stafford Beck, this family wasn't just running a brothel, they were running a death trap. The nightmare is believed to have started when her sons, Ed and Mike, lost control and, in a violent fit of rage, took the lives of two women who were living at their brothel. But they didn't stop there. The Staffelbacks turned their establishment into a macabre business, robbing and taking the lives of many of the unsuspecting souls who wandered in looking for some company. While the law only managed to pin one crime against a miner whose body was unceremoniously dumped in a mine shaft on the family, whispers and rumors suggested that the Staffelbacks might have been responsible for up to 50 deaths. The true extent of their gruesome spree remains buried in history, but the chilling legacy of Nancy and her sons serve as a dark reminder of the evil that can fester behind closed doors, turning a simple house into a den of death and despair. Next, we are talking about the Murdoch family. A long-standing pillar of South Carolina's legal scene, this family turned from being revered into reviled as their saga unfolded like a southern gothic tale dripping with scandal and tragedy. Starting in the 18th century, the Murdochs were a force in the Low Country, dominating the judiciary for nearly a century. 3 generations of Randolph Murdaghs consecutively held the post of circuit solicitor from 1920 to 2006, earning the 5-county area the name Murdoch Country. Yeah. The family's law firm, founded in 1910 by Randolph Murdoch Sr., thrived on personal injury litigation. However, beneath the surface of legal triumphs lay a murky world of crime and corruption. Richard Alex Murdoch, along with various family members, became embroiled in a web of killing, fraud, theft, and witness intimidation. The turning point came in 2019 when Alex's son Paul was charged with felony counts related to a fatal boating accident, sparking allegations of preferential treatment. The dark underbelly of the Murdoch dynasty was fully exposed in June 2021 when Alex's wife Maggie and son Paul were found with their lives taken at their estate. Alex was later charged with the crime, and in 2023 he was found guilty, receiving 2 consecutive life sentences without parole. This high-profile case, covered extensively by media, including an entire Netflix series, peeled back layers of a family that wielded enormous power only to be undone by their own grievous misdeeds. From legal luminaries to convicted felons, the Murdoch's story is a dramatic fall from grace, marked by a tragic blend of power, deception, and violence that turned Murdoch country into a land of infamy.
Think about Rex Herman. It's almost impossible to imagine how someone who seemed so ordinary could have been hiding such a dark side. By day, Herman was just another businessman, a well-respected architect living in Long Island. He had a stable job, a family, and by all outward appearances, a very normal life. You wouldn't look at him and think, oh yeah, that guy's hiding something, but he was. The Long Island serial killer, the Manorville Butcher, the Craigslist Ripper. These were all names given to the unidentified assailant responsible for the Gilgo Beach serial killings. In 2010, police discovered a set of bodies along a stretch of Gilgo Beach. Over time, more bodies were found in the area, leading investigators to believe that a serial killer was at work. The victims were mostly women who worked as escorts and advertised on Craigslist, and their bodies were found in a similar manner, usually wrapped in burlap. The killings were thought to have taken place between 1996 and 2010, and for a long time the case was a complete mystery. That is, until very recently. In 2022, police started to investigate an architect named Rex Herman. His cell phone records showed that he'd had contact with 3 of the victims, and his internet history showed he'd been keeping track of the investigation incessantly, as well as looking up some very disturbing things online. Plus, his vehicle had been connected to one of the killings, and one of his hairs was found in one of the burlap sacks containing one of the bodies. On June 6th of 2024, Rex was charged with the killing of 6 women. He's also under investigation for the death of a woman named Valerie Mack in 2000. To the people around him, Richard Cottingham was just another average guy. He had a steady job, seemingly normal life, but his life was anything but normal, at least the part of it he was hiding. Cottingham is now known as the Torso Killer, or the Times Square Ripper, and his crimes were just as brutal as they sound. He's currently serving multiple life sentences for his confirmed killings, but he later admitted to much more, telling a journalist in 2009 that he'd taken the lives of 80 to 100 women across the US. Cottingham had managed to keep this hidden from his family and friends for years. He was married with kids, and from the outside, he looked like he was living a standard suburban life. In 1967, Cottingham killed a woman named Nancy Vogel. 2 years later, he got married, and for the next 11 years, he continued his crimes without his family knowing. He was finally arrested in 1980 and has been in prison ever since. The story of the San Francisco witch killers is one of those cases that really makes you question how well you can ever truly know someone. The San Francisco witch killers were involved in a string of horrific killings. They were convicted for 3 killings between 1981 and 1983, which after the last guy doesn't sound like a lot, but that's still 3 people being killed. That's a big deal, no matter how you look at it. And what's incredibly disturbing is how a woman named Jen Carson had to deal with the revelation that her father, James Carson, and her stepmother, Suzanne Barnes, were the ones behind it. Jen Carson was young when she found out the truth about her father and stepmother. Her father and his wife weren't just petty criminals, they'd been responsible for brutal, heinous acts. This obviously had a profound impact on her mental and emotional well-being. In Jen Carson's very own words, "If my father could kill people, then I reasoned anyone could be a killer." I can't imagine how it would feel learning of something like this. Like, how would you ever trust anyone again? You'd look at everyone you met, anyone who got too close, and just constantly be wondering, spending every day with this all-consuming fear that the people around you may not be who they seem. Kray Rawson's case is also similar. She's the daughter of Dennis Rader, aka the BTK Killer. Dennis Rader chose the nickname BTK himself, which stands for bind, torment, for YouTube guidelines' sake, and kill. He led a double life as one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. To the outside world, he was a respectable man. He had a steady job, he was very active in his church, and he appeared to be a loving family man. But behind closed doors, he was committing these horrific crimes. Kray Rawson had no idea of the brutal acts her father was committing, of course, but her entire world came crashing down when the truth was finally revealed. Suddenly, she had to face the reality that he was capable of unimaginable violence. Kary's struggle was incredibly public and personal. As she wrote, "I found out my father was the BTK killer when I was 26. I was in shock and I didn't know how to handle it." Keith Jesperson led a double life for years, all while keeping up the appearance of being a good, upstanding citizen. He had a family and was a truck driver, which made it easy for him to travel and commit his crimes without raising much suspicion. For his daughter, Melissa G. Moore, the revelation that her father was the happy-faced killer was absolutely devastating. In November of 2008, Melissa appeared on Dr. Phil and the Oprah Winfrey Show to talk about her father and her own experience dealing with the aftermath of his crimes. She opened up about how learning the truth about her father completely shattered her world. She described how the discovery left her feeling betrayed and confused. She also appeared on A&E's Monster in My Family, saying, "Being the daughter of a serial killer puts everything into question. Am I worthy? Do I have the right to exist when he took so much away from other people? If I'm happy, is that a slap in the face to the victims' families? I don't want it to be."
Starting off today, we are talking about the Harpe brothers. Micah Big Harpe and Wiley Little Harpe were notorious outlaws who roamed the American frontier in the late 18th century, earning the grim title of America's first documented serial killers. These brothers were a brutal duo who left a bloody trail across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, claiming the lives of at least 39 people. Their crimes weren't just about the body count, they took a very dark pleasure in the cruelty of their methods, often harming their victims in ways that sent shockwaves of horror through the communities they terrorized. Beyond their savage crimes, the Harpes were also known for their thievery and for setting fires to cover their tracks or create diversions. Their reign of terror came to a gruesome end when they were finally captured, but their tales of brutality lived on, painting them as a sort of boogeyman of the early American wilderness. Next, we are talking about the Gonzalez sisters. Delfina and Maria were infamous figures in Mexico during the 1950s and 1960s, not just for running a large sex work ring, but for the terrifying manner in which they managed their illicit business. These sisters turned their ranch into a nightmarish hub of criminal activity where they lured countless young women with promises of legitimate jobs, only to force them into a life of darkness and crime. The depths of their cruelty didn't stop there. The sisters were notoriously brutal, punishing and sometimes killing the women over minor infractions or when they became too ill or too old to work. They also didn't hesitate to eliminate any clients who crossed them or knew too much, but by the time the authorities caught up with them, it was revealed that their reign of terror resulted in the deaths of at least 91 people. Next, we are moving on to the Shelton Brothers gang. Led by the notorious trio of Carl, Earl, and Bernie Shelton, they were a force to be reckoned with in southern Illinois during the Prohibition era. These brothers turned bootlegging into an art form, running illegal alcohol with a mix of charm and brute force. They didn't just stop at smuggling hooch, they expanded their empire into gambling and weren't shy about knocking out the competition, literally. Their battles with rival gangs were like the stuff of legend, featuring high-octane shootouts and dramatic bombings, siblings, but the Sheltons were also very savvy political operators. They knew that a little influence could go a long way, so they cozied up to local politicians to shield their operations from the law. Whether it was bribing officials or intimidating enemies, they had a hand in shaping the political landscape to suit their needs. Their blend of criminal cunning and entrepreneurial spirit made them a powerhouse during one of America's most tumultuous times, and their legacy is a wild chapter in the history of the American Midwest's underworld. Next, we are talking about the DeMeo crew, an infamous arm of the Gambino Mafia family. They were the epitome of ruthless efficiency in New York City's underworld during the 1970s and the 1980s. Led by the notorious Roy DeMeo, this gang was feared for their brutal tactics and cold-blooded efficiency. They weren't just your average mobsters. These guys turned crime into a gruesome art form, specializing in a method they dubbed the Gemini method, which involved taking the lives of their victims, then systematically dismembering them to dispose of the bodies more effectively. Unsettling. It's believed they were responsible for up to 100 of these gruesome crimes, leaving a trail of terror across the city. Their operations weren't limited to eliminating rivals or unfortunate snitches. They dipped their bloody hands into various mafia enterprises, from car theft rings known as the car theft capital of the world to substance trafficking and loan sharking. Next, we are talking about the Sackler family, owners of Purdue Pharma. They are often seen as the face of the opioid crisis that has ravaged communities across the United States. They made their fortune from OxyContin, a powerful painkiller that became a blockbuster drug thanks to aggressive marketing and sales tactics. Despite its effectiveness for pain relief, OxyContin also became infamous for its addictive qualities, a fact that many accuse the Sacklers of deliberately downplaying to boost sales. As the death toll from opioid overdoses soared into the hundreds of thousands, the family found themselves in hot water, facing a barrage of lawsuits from states, cities, and individuals claiming Purdue Pharma's practices contributed significantly to the epidemic. The Sacklers saga is a very complex mix of medical innovation, corporate greed, and a public health disaster, leaving a legacy mired in controversy and a nation grappling with the consequences of addiction. Next, we are talking about the Duvalier family, led first by Francois Papadoc and then led by his son Jean-Claude Baby Doc. They dominated Haiti from 1957 to 1986, and their reign was nothing short of a horror movie come to life. Papadoc, a former doctor turned dictator, used his private militia, the Tonton Macoute, as a tool of terror. These guys were aptly named after a boogeyman from Haitian folklore, but their horror was unfortunately very real. They enforced Papadoc's rule through torment, kidnappings, and the disappearance of anyone who whispered a word of dissent. When Papadoc passed away, his son Baby Doc took over and the nightmare continued. Under their rule, Haiti was stripped of its wealth, with the Duvaliers living large while the country plunged into poverty and chaos. Their legacy? A lasting shadow of fear and corruption that still darkens Haitian politics. It's a stark reminder of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely, leaving a nation to collect the pieces long after they were gone. Next, we are talking about the Rajneesh family, or the followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who later rebranded himself as Osho. They were more like a tight-knit cult than a traditional family. In the early 1980s, this group set up a commune called Rajneeshpuram in the wilds of Oregon, creating a mini-city complete with its own airport, malls, and police force. Their goal? To live out the spiritual leader's vision of a utopian society. However, of course, things took a dark turn when they attempted to take over the local government in Wasco County. Under the directive of Ma Anand Sheela, Osho's fiery personal secretary, the Rajneeshis hatched a plan to win a county election by incapacitating the local voter base. In a shocking move, they spread salmonella bacteria on salad bars in 10 local restaurants, sickening over 750 people in one of the largest bioterror attacks in US history. But their scheming didn't stop at biological warfare. I guess that just wasn't enough. They were also caught engaging in a slew of other illegal activities, including immigration fraud, wiretapping, and even plotting assassinations to silence their critics.
Gerald and Alice Uden weren't each other's first loves. In fact, fact, they were far from it. Both of them had been married before they met, and both of them had a secret. In 1974, Alice Uden was a mother married to a man named Ronald Holtz, but less than a year and a half later, Alice filed for divorce. Only problem was, Holtz was nowhere to be found. In 1980, Gerald Uden was married and a stepfather to 2 sons, until one day both his wife and her sons mysteriously vanished. When Gerald and Alice met, they fell in love and started a life together. They went to church and engaged in pleasant conversations with their neighbors, one of which was quoted saying, "They're the kind of neighbors you leaned over the fence and talked about your chickens with." They were, as far as anyone knew, the definition of the wholesome old couple next door. But all of that changed when the pair entered their 70s. It was then that Alice's son Todd told police that his mother had once admitted to killing his father, her husband, and hiding the body in a gold mine. After the shocking revelation about Alice came out, police decided to begin looking into Gerald's past, which is when they found out that the pair had way more in common than previously thought. Gerald confessed to killing his ex-wife and her 2 sons with a hunting weapon she had actually gotten him as a present. Gerald was charged with killing in the first degree, and Alice, who claimed to have killed her husband in an act of self-defense, was charged with man 1.
Joseph Terracone was a man from the US who, in the 80s, was involved in a truly horrifying family scandal that went under the radar for decades. Joseph Terracone was a man from the US who in the late 70s was involved in a truly horrifying family scandal that went under the radar for decades. Terracone disappeared in 1978 after visiting his daughter in Hawaii. For nearly 30 years, no one knew what happened to him. His entire family was left completely in the dark. But the truth was finally uncovered in 2007. Terracone had been in a relationship with a woman named Renee Curtis at the time of his disappearance. When their relationship started to sour, Curtis and her brother Nicholas Notaro decided to get rid of him. Notaro fired at Terracone twice in the head. To cover up the crime, he and Curtis dismembered the body with a chainsaw and buried the remains. And the secret remained buried until construction workers discovered the body parts while demolishing Curtis's old house. Yeah, for some reason they figured home would be the best place to keep a dead body. Notaro admitted to the killing and was sentenced to life in prison. Curtis also confessed to helping dispose of the body, but denied having any involvement in planning the crime. Despite her claims though, she was also given a full life sentence.
In 1983, UK dentist Colin Howell and housewife Hazel Stewart were madly in love. Only problem was they were married and not to each other. After a while of hiding their affair and many repeated attempts at reconciling their own respective marriages, the two came up with a plan: to kill their current spouses and run away together. In 1991, Colin Howell poisoned his wife to death with carbon monoxide before arriving at his mistress, Hazel Stewart's house. In 1991, Colin Howell poisoned his wife to death with carbon monoxide before arriving at his mistress, Hazel Stewart's house, his wife's body in hand. When Colin arrived, Stewart set her half of the plan into action and did the same thing to her husband Howell had done to his wife. After both of their prospective spouses were dead, Howell and Stewart staged a scene. They propped both of the bodies up in a car in Stewart's garage to make it seem as though the pair had taken their own lives. And after all that, Howell and Stewart went their separate ways. Colin Howell eventually remarried and for a while lived a relatively normal life until one day he confessed his crime to his new wife. At first, she urged him to keep quiet for the sake of their family, but eventually, after Howell fell into some financial troubles and began cheating again, his wife changed her mind and ultimately turned Howell into the police. He received a prison term of 21 years and his co-conspirator Hazel Stewart a minimum of 18 years behind bars.
Skidmore, Missouri is a very small town with a very big, dark secret, and it's not just one family's secret, it's the entire town's. This is the case of Ken Rex McElroy, the Boogeyman of Skidmore, whose story almost plays out like a real-life version of Nightmare on Elm Street. So back in the 60s and 70s, Skidmore was ruled by a man named Ken McElroy, who is infamous for being a total bully and a criminal. He pretty much ran the town, and for over 2 decades, he reigned over it like a mad dictator. He'd steal from local farmers and businesses, commit violence on townsfolk at will, and engaged in all sorts of other criminal behavior. He also had multiple wives, many of whom he'd just taken unwillingly. With the help of a mob-connected lawyer, McElroy was virtually untouchable, intimidating anyone who dared to press charges. He would stalk people, kill people's pets, burn homes and businesses to the ground in order to maintain his grip on the town. By July of 1981, though, people had had enough. A mob of fed-up locals who'd endured years of his terror surrounded him in the center of town and opened fire. McElroy was shot dead, but not one of the more than 50 witnesses came forward to identify who pulled the trigger, and no one was ever arrested. To this day, every single witness has refused to talk, and the case remains unsolved.
Diane Stout lost her husband and her son and witnessed her daughter grow incredibly ill in the span of just 1 year. Her husband passed without warning, seemingly of natural causes. Her son died of what seemed to be seizure-related complications, and one of her daughters, Sarah, was rushed to hospital requiring emergency attention for flu-like symptoms that later revealed themselves to be the result of organ failure. While one might think Diane to have been crushed by this dark series of unfortunate events, many were surprised and deeply disturbed to notice how cheerful she remained throughout the entirety of each ordeal. At the funeral of both her husband and her son, she seemed pretty unmoved and, as I said to some, almost happy. When her daughter almost lost her life to organ failure, Diane spent the majority of her time in the hospital making jokes about going on vacation. All of this strange behavior eventually led people to suspect that the deaths and illnesses that occurred in the family were no mere fluke of nature, but rather the doing of Diane herself. It turns out Diane had actually been conspiring with her other daughter Rachel to kill off the rest of the family one by one until only the 2 of them remained. For their crimes, both women were sentenced to life behind bars.
This next story comes
Starting off this list, we are talking about the Lafferty brothers. Ron and Dan were not just your typical criminals, part of a radical polygamist group that broke away from the mainstream Mormon church. These brothers turned their religious beliefs into a nightmare. In 1984, they shockingly claimed that God had told them to commit horrifying crimes. Their victims? Couple members of their own family. The brutality of the crimes involving a weapon and a very personal attack absolutely rocked the nation, especially because the brothers showed no remorse, believing that they were carrying out a divine command. This very chilling story is a stark reminder of how dangerously twisted the path of fanaticism can definitely become. Next, we are talking about the Ripper Crew, often remembered as one of Chicago's most horrifying gangs in the early 1980s. This was not just an average group of criminals. They were led by the disturbingly charismatic Robin Gecht. This quartet of men transformed their twisted fantasies into a very gruesome reality. Their crimes weren't just shocking for the sheer brutality of them, they involved some horrific details that ended in the deaths of at least 18 women. But of course, it didn't stop there. The Ripper Crew elevated their wickedness to another level with human consumption and very bizarre ritualistic practices, including amputations performed to satisfy Gecht's grotesque obsessions. Their rituals, believed to involve eating parts of their victims as a way to gain power, still send shivers down the spine of those who remember the case. Just horrific. There's really no other word for it other than just absolutely horrific. Next up, we are talking about the Papin sisters. The Papin sisters, Christine and Leah, were the centerpiece of one of France's most chilling cases. Back in 1933, these 2 seemingly quiet live-in maids snapped in a spectacularly horrific way. They brutally took the life of their employer's wife and daughter in France. The details were gruesome. The victims' eyes were gouged out, and the attacks were so violent that even the police couldn't believe what they were seeing. This wasn't just a simple crime of rage, the sisters worked in tandem, methodically carrying out the crimes in a way that left the nation reeling. What makes the sisters' story so captivating is how it peeled back the veneer of domestic tranquility to expose a deep, dark vein of class tension and psychological turmoil. These sisters weren't just maids, they were symbols of the oppressed working class, pushed to the brink by their subservient roles and eventually breaking in the most dramatic way possible. I'm definitely not victim blaming at all. It just is definitely one of those cases where there's just a lot going on. The backstory is pretty wild. Their trial was of course a media sensation, stirring up debates about mental health, workers' rights, and the hidden despair lurking in ordinary lives. In the end, the sisters' saga is a macabre tale of what happens when the human mind is pushed too far, wrapped in a mystery that still fascinates and horrifies people to this day. And I'm sure for as long as we remember the story, it will always be absolutely horrifying. Next, we are talking about the Briley Brothers, Linwood, James, and Anthony, who all turned 1979 Richmond, Virginia into their personal hunting ground in a chilling spree that lasted over 7 months. These brothers weren't picky, they engaged in random acts of violence, home invasions, and cold-blooded crimes, racking up at least 11 victims. Their reign of terror included not just killing, but also tormenting their victims and stealing anything that they could get their hands on. Just imagine the fear that gripped Richmond as these brothers moved from one crime to the next, seemingly always one step ahead of the law. The manhunt to catch them was one of Virginia's most intense and nerve-wracking, with the whole community holding its breath until they were thankfully finally brought to justice. Next, we're talking about the Bloody Benders, who were like the horror movie family you hope to never meet. Operating in Kansas during the 1870s, they ran a seemingly innocent inn and general store, but with a very grisly twist. The family, led by the very mysterious John Bender and his equally mysterious kin, had a very chilling side hustle, killing their guests for cash. Travelers would check in and, well, they wouldn't really check out. The Benders cleverly positioned their victims at a seat of honor at their dinner table, which was unfortunately placed over a trap door. I'm not laughing, that's just crazy that that's real. I feel like that's only in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but nope, very real. After a hearty meal, the guest would be whacked on the head and then dropped into the cellar to meet a very grim fate. This went on until the neighborhood started noticing that people who visited the Benders tended to disappear into thin air. Honest to God, thank you for the nosy neighbor in that situation. Alright, sometimes a nosy neighbor can be annoying, but I guess when the Benders are in town, we need them. When the suspicions grew too intense, the Benders did what any family of criminal masterminds would do. They vanished. By the time the locals pieced everything together and dug up the property, the Benders were long gone, leaving behind a legacy that turned their homestead into an infamous chapter of Wild West lore. Yeah, they just vanished. No justice in that story. Next, we are talking about Behram and the Thuggee cult. The story of Behram and the cult are like something straight out of a horror classic, but this nightmare was very real in 19th century India. Behram, who was the cult's most infamous leader, is often called one of history's worst killers. So basically, the whole thing was a secretive gang called the Thuggees, and they roamed the Indian countryside with a very chilling mission. Their MO was to befriend travelers, take their lives with a ceremonial scarf called a rumal, and then rob them blind. They did this all under the guise of worshipping the goddess Kali, believing their crimes were a form of devotion. The leader himself is said to have been directly involved in taking the lives of over 900 people. The British eventually cracked down on this crime group, but the sheer scale of their crimes and the cold-bloodedness of the leaders like Behram still boggle the mind even today. Next, we're talking about the Carrington family, also sometimes known as the Fall River cult. In the late 1970s, the quiet town of Fall River, Massachusetts became the backdrop for a horrifying series of events. events. Carl Drew and Robin Murphy, two seemingly ordinary individuals, actually led a satanic cult that included members of the Carrington family. This dark and twisted group was involved in the brutal, ritualistic killings of 3 women, shocking everyone with the level of violence and the satanic practices involved. The crimes were not just gruesome, they were carried out with a ceremonial cruelty that suggested that they were more than mere killings. They were actually rituals meant to honor some nefarious unseen force. As the cult continued their sinister activities, the local community lived in fear, and the mysterious aura surrounding the Carrington family grew. Details emerged of rituals, sacrifices, and an unsettling belief in dark powers, painting a picture of a family caught in the grip of something truly evil. This saga of brutality, mysticism, and mayhem left an indelible mark on Fall River, turning the Carrington family into a name synonymous with one of the most disturbing chapters in the town's history.
The Chicken Whackers. Sounds like a comedy troupe rather than a cult, but there are some very disturbing stories about this group. Now, it's hard to find any real info on them. They are very elusive. Not a lot of people know about the Chicken Whackers, but for those living on the streets of Colorado, especially in Grand Junction, stories about the Chicken Whackers are whispered about all the time. Even some law enforcement have heard of the group, which has been described as this cross between a satanic cult and a cartel. There are stories about the group performing dark rituals and human sacrifices, kidnapping homeless people in the night, and also being involved in the black market. The group is so underground that authorities really aren't even sure if they exist or if it's just some urban legend, but one thing is for sure, homeless people on the streets feel that they're under constant threat from some kind of group.
Next up, we've got one that you might know. It's the Order of the Solar Temple, which for some reason I always want to pronounce as Templar. I think it's because of the Knights of Templar. That's irrelevant. It's a religious cult founded by Jim Jones. It was founded in Indiana in 1955. When the cult was created, Jones used a blend of Christian, socialist, and communist ideals to entice his followers to join him, and it worked. At its peak, the cult organization had attracted thousands of followers. Although the People's Temple originally had its headquarters and held its meetings in North America, mainly California, it eventually moved to Guyana after receiving a significant amount of backlash from the US media, which of course is what sparked the birth of Jonestown, a cult commune in Guyana home to around 900 People's Temple cult members, including Jim Jones himself. Shortly after the move to South America, the United States media began receiving reports of cult members participating in rehearsals of mass voluntary death. At this time, residents of Jonestown were also being subjected to attack simulations, one of which lasted 6 days, and members of the cult were only informed after the incident was over that it had just been a drill. In 1978, a congressman, Leo Ryan, visited the commune on a fact-finding mission, and he ended up leaving with 5 temple members who no longer wished to be a part of the organization. I do not blame them. Jones let him leave the compound, but then had him and many others killed as they tried to board a plane back to North America. Later that month, Jones staged a mass killing. He ordered his disciples to drink poison and fired weapons at ones who refused. 909 people died that day, including Jones himself, who, after the deaths of his disciples, turned the weapon on himself and took his own life. That's a pretty big number. Manson family has nothing on them.
Next on the list, we have the New Light of God, an evangelical cult who attempted to evangelize a native tribe in Panama back in 2020, but rather than spreading messages of peace and love, they resorted to violence and brutality in their attempts to convert the indigenous Nabe people. They used fear and intimidation to try and bring them into the fold and have them repent for their supposed sins. They attacked villagers, clubbing and burning and hacking them to death with machetes. Several villagers had shown up at the hospital with severe burns on their tongues and mouths, covered in bruises. Police ended up storming the area, breaking up this insane ritual which was going on right when they arrived. It was happening in a makeshift church that the group had constructed. 2 pregnant women were tied up. In front of them was a goat that had just been ritualistically sacrificed. The survivors were rescued and 10 people were arrested in connection to the cult. Nearby was a shallow grave with the remains of 7 dead villagers who'd been killed by Mario Gonzalez, the leader of the cult. The most disturbing part? Most of the villagers he killed were related to him. 5 were his grandchildren, and 1, Belline Flores, was his very own daughter.
Next up, we've got Heaven's Gate. Shout out, Eternal Atake. Like Solar Temple, you might have heard of this one before, but let's get into the nitty gritty. Heaven's Gate was a UFO cult founded in the early 1970s by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, both of whom believed that aliens would visit the Earth and wipe it clean in the year 1997. It was a smaller cult with about 39 active members who were taught by Applewhite and Nettles to believe that the human body was nothing more than a container, a disgusting container, and to abandon the human body meant giving oneself the opportunity to ascend to a higher realm, which the pair referred to as the Kingdom of Heaven, which they believed was located on the Hale-Bopp comet, a real comet set to make its closest interaction with Earth in the year 1997. And of course, by abandoning the human body, Applewhite and Nettles had been referring to one taking their own life. But prior to the final act, members of the cult were told that they had to prepare their souls by following a strict set of guidelines that would grant them access to the Kingdom of Heaven. No family ties, no ties with anyone outside of the group for that matter, no worldly possessions, and no adult activities with others or oneself. Some people went so far as to get the old to keep their urges down. Anyways, when 1997 rolled around, Nettles was dead, and Marshall Applewhite, who despite guidelines he had set for the group had been having adult relations with many of the members, convinced his followers to drink poison and end their lives, which they did, and Applewhite followed suit.
The Angel's Landing cult was led by a man named Daniel Perez. He and his followers lived on a lavish commune in Wichita, Kansas, where Perez secretly ran life insurance frauds, and it gets much worse than that. He was living off of life insurance which he'd received from his deceased followers, who he'd actually killed, but would promise that they were going to come back from the dead. See, he'd convinced his followers that he was an angel who could see into the future. Oh, and of course he managed to convince families on the commune that he needed to sleep with their daughters in order to stay alive. In February of 2015, Perez's crimes came to light and he received 20 life sentences. Perfect for a, eternally living angel, I guess.
Next up, we've got the Order of the Solar Temple, a religious cult founded in Geneva in 1984 by 2 men, Joseph de Montbreau and Luc Jort. I can't speak French. With its beliefs, originally rooted in New Age spiritualism, the cult, which had garnered the attention of people from Switzerland all the way to Canada, soon began revolving around the idea of the world's end. AKA, it became a doomsday cult. Classic. By the 1990s, the cult had gained quite a bit of attention from Canadian authorities, who believed that the leaders of the group had been coercing members into having adult relations with them, which prompted a number of members to part ways with the sham organization. In 1994, a former member spoke out against the cult publicly and was later killed in his home, as were his wife and their son. A few days after that incident, things started to really heat up. Literally. 2 solar temple buildings in Switzerland were intentionally set on fire in a mass voluntary death ritual event that claimed the lives of 48 members, including the organization's founders, although it is believed that not all of those who died in the fire were willing participants. The following year, in 1995, a solar temple in the Swiss Alps met the same fate, killing 16, and in 1997, 74 cult members and former cult members died after a fire was intentionally set in a home in Quebec, in Canada.
Starting off this countdown, we have the ventriloquist doll. I don't know about you, but some dolls freak me out, like this one. This picture is the definition of creepy. Who said it was okay for that girl to bring her doll for the family photo? Or maybe that's their brother that got cursed and got transformed into a dummy. Or their brother wasn't available for the family photo, so they decided to make a lifelike doll of him, to take his place. Or the doll is haunted and is possessing their family. There's just too many options here, I swear, this is how dolls become haunted though. You start treating them like family, and next thing you know, a soul inhabits it. Didn't that happen to the famous haunted doll, Robert? Anyways, this picture would have been better off with just the girls and their little cat and dog. There was no need for the puppet doll as well. Moving on to number 9, we have What's on Your Mind. First off, shout out to the old hairstyles, glasses, and outfits. This must have been taken in the 70s. I mean, back then, this was probably a very cool artistic photo. But nowadays, it makes you wonder, why? Just why? Maybe it's symbolic, like the father has got his family constantly on his mind. That's a sweet message, but it also almost looks like a funeral card. Coming in at number 8, we have Creepy Santa. What is going on with Santa in this picture? I guess this is a mask that the guy is wearing, but it's not jolly at all. No, he looks like a serial killer. No one should be brought near this Santa. He'll just scoop the kids in a bag and then take them off to hell or something. And that's probably why the kids look so frightened in the photo. They had to stand next to this creepy guy. Honestly, one look at this guy and I would have ran out of the room. Like, that's not Santa, that's my sleep paralysis demon. Seriously, where did they find this costume? The Halloween store? In our 7th spot, we have post-mortem photography. Back in the day, it was a trend for family members to take photos with their deceased relatives or loved ones. So photographers would prop the dead bodies up or display them so they kind of looked alive. And then family members would pose around them. This is what's happening in this photo. The individual on the floor sadly has passed away. Now what's creepy is that half of the family is smiling like nothing happened, whereas the other half look like they're in pain or just uncomfortable. Honestly, it's the fact that people are smiling around the dead body that creeps me out. Now, why did people do this back then? Well, for a number of reasons. First, it was a way to deal with their grief. Second, it helped preserve the image of the loved one that passed away. And third, it was like a little memento. This trend became common in Victorian England when there was a rise of short lifespans for the young, which is really sad. Moving on to number 6, we have these superheroes. So when you're growing up and you're all like, my mom and dad are my heroes. Well, this is certainly not what this kid meant by that. So I'm not gonna lie, the Superman and Wonder Woman costumes are actually really well done, minus the fact that Superman's logo is upside down. Hey, maybe he just didn't want to get copyrighted or something. But still, they look good. And then we have Spider-Man. You can tell by the expression on the kid's face that he is not comfortable with whatever is behind him, because that's not Spider-Man. More like, Spider-Man, this kid ain't going home, he's coming home with me. Also, smash that like button if you've seen the new Spider-Man movie. No spoilers, but let me know in the comments below if you liked it.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have King Charles I. Okay, so this is one that goes way back, and it really creeps me out. So King Charles I was tried for treason after the Civil War, and he ended up being beheaded in 1649. I guess in the 1600s, everyone was beheaded, so this wasn't necessarily abnormal, which certainly is weird, but that's a history lesson for another day. The weird part, however, is that apparently his head was sewn back on his body so that he could sit for a portrait, or it was perhaps supposed to be a sign of respect. Either way, it's weird and very gross. I feel terrible for whoever's job it was to do that, and I also feel bad for the artist who was forced to paint that. Talk about a little traumatic. It does certainly make sense though that people say that Charles' ghost still haunts a building, because there is no amount of haunting that could make up for being beheaded and then having your head sewn back onto your body. No thanks. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Kensington system. Queen Victoria's reign began in 1837 and it lasted up until her death in 1901. She was just 18 years old when she found herself on the throne, and it was all by chance, as she was actually 5th in line when she was born. This is all stressful enough, but certainly one of the worst parts of her upbringing was being brought up under the Kensington system. This means that her mother, Duchess Victoria of Kent, who created this system in order to control her daughter, literally just isolated her away from all of her friends and even from other family members, and apparently this was done to keep her quote-unquote pure. The Duchess would monitor her every move. She would decide who she could see and who she could speak to. Victoria only had 2 friends she could play with growing up, one being her half-sister and the other being her mother's attendant, Sir John Conroy. Victoria was even forced to share a room with her mother, and until she was the queen, she couldn't even walk down the hall by herself. In the end, Victoria placed a lot of blame on John Conroy for manipulating her mother. She even called him the demon incarnate. In our number 8 spot today, we have money making. We obviously know that the British royal family is rich. It certainly isn't a surprise to any of us to hear that. I mean, they made a tax-free $97 million in 2017, so it's not like they're struggling by any stretch of the imagination. And while there are claims that most of their income comes from their private estates and tourism, not everyone believes that this is the case. There are actually quite a few people who believe that the royal family costs British taxpayers a whopping $450 million a year. That's a ton of money. I truly do not know enough about anything to really choose a side, but it certainly is something to think about. I know with taxpayer money we pay a lot of salaries, and it's usually for a good reason, but $450 million is definitely next level. In our number 7 spot today, we have the change of name. So for us here in Canada, later in May, we have a day called Victoria Day. We set off fireworks, people have barbecues, it's like one of those types of holidays. Back in 1819, Queen Victoria, of course, before she was queen, was christened in a mostly private ceremony. It was quite small, her uncle only let a few people come, and at the time of this christening, her name was Alexandrina Victoria. Apparently during this time period, the name Victoria wasn't looked at as a regal name. It had French origin and was almost unique at the time. So flash forward to when Queen Victoria is first taking the throne, she begins getting advised to change her name. They thought that it would give her a better public image if she had a more traditional name. Clearly, as the history books and our Canadian calendars show us, Queen Victoria said, yeah, no thanks, I'm not gonna do that. In our number 6 spot today, we have the controversial history. The British royal family has quite a history of being perhaps less inclusive of others than would normally be accepted. There is actually quite an extensive history of racism in the royal family, and as we now know, especially after that Oprah interview last year, things haven't necessarily recently changed either. There have been certain gestures or small remarks made here and there that have definitely been a little out of touch, I'll call it. And unfortunately, Meghan Markle, being a biracial person, had to experience a lot of it firsthand. I mean, just to give a few examples, Prince Philip did ask Indigenous Australians if they still throw spears at each other, okay? And once, Princess Michael of Kent tried to apologize after being called out for saying something racist, and this is what she said, quote, "To call me racist, it's a knife through the heart because I really love these people. I even pretended years ago to be an African, a half-caste African, but because of my light eyes I did not get away with it, but I dyed my hair black." Okay, there is so much to unpack in that one sentence alone, but I have an extremely strong feeling that this apology probably wasn't well received, especially considering it lacked the whole apology part of an apology.
Of course, the question on everyone's mind right now is where the actual God Save the Queen is Kate Middleton. It's no secret that the princess has been MIA ever since she went in for a planned abdominal surgery on January 16th of this year. But since then, none of the British public, or global public for that matter, have any idea where she might be, how she might be recovering, or, let's be honest, whether or not she even made it out of the surgery. The palace released a statement saying she's doing well, but beyond that, there really hasn't been much news. I think it's also quite strange that it was the palace who made the announcement of the planned surgery, not Kate herself. Not to mention, the days leading up to and after the surgery, Kate had many events that she had to cancel. Something else that's quite odd is that after King Charles III's cancer diagnosis, the public were able to see him and wish him well as he exited the hospital, and Kate was never seen. Not one image captured by even the sneakiest of paparazzi was released. It's also quite surprising that there have been no images released of the recovering princess, who was quick to get glam with full hair and makeup just 24 hours after giving birth for a photo shoot with her newborn. The public is begging for a sign that the princess is okay, but as the days since her last appearance add up, they have begun to fear the worst. Speculations that Kate entered into a coma after surgery, or perhaps was killed during the process, have started to circle around the internet.
Next up, we have the death of Princess Diana, and the theory that it wasn't as accidental as it seemed. There are lots of conspiracies about Princess Diana's death, but one of the most well-known and probably the darkest is that it was the royal family themselves that were actually behind it. Princess Diana had recently divorced Prince Charles, and leading up to her death, she was apparently concerned that something was going to happen to her. In October of 1996, Diana wrote a letter to Paul Burrell. In part of the letter, she talked about how she felt in danger because someone was planning an accident in her car, brake failure, and serious head injury in order to make the path clear for Charles to marry. Pretty eerie, considering how she actually died, of course. Princess Diana and Dottie Fade were supposedly planning to announce their engagement on September 1st of 1997, and there was a rumor that Diana was also pregnant. So the idea here is that the royal family disapproved of Diana marrying Fade, that she was going against traditions and planned the incident, making it look like an accident. Even Fade's own father, Muhammad al-Fade, firmly believes that the royal family was involved in Diana and his son's death.
Next, I want to talk about William. Prince William, that is, and what the heck is going on with all the press as of late speculating on what would happen if William were to be charged with a serious crime. I'm not sure if this is complete and utter speculation or if the popularity of the topic is due to a leak that came from inside castle walls, but let's get to it nonetheless. In the past, both William and Kate have been accused of embezzling funds from charitable organizations as well as misusing public funds for personal gain. It has also been said that the pair were involved in covering up an unknown crime that took place inside castle walls, and that they are involved in criminal organizations that specialize in money laundering and smuggling. If any of these allegations are true, it makes the fact that we haven't seen the princess in over a month due to her alleged surgery all the more concerning.
Next up, we have Prince Margaret. There's a name like nobody hears anymore. Prince Margaret's secret offspring. So Prince Margaret was once romantically involved with a man named Peter Townsend before marrying Anthony Armstrong. Back in 1947, during a royal tour of South Africa, Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend started their relationship. Townsend had become close to the royal family by taking on a role with the Queen Mother, having become the comptroller of the household for the Queen Mother. Now, supposedly, it wasn't just a relationship that blossomed during this short period of time. A man named Robert Brown later came out claiming to be the illegitimate son of Princess Margaret and Townsend. He was born in Kenya in 1955, and seeking answers went to the High Court to make his case. And in 2014, he actually did win a High Court victory that allowed him to view Princess Margaret's will. Now, it's never been confirmed as to whether he found anything that would prove his claims, but he's always said that as soon as he was born, he was sent to Kenya, or he was arranged to be adopted into the family that he ended up being raised by.
Up next, it's time to talk about the king again, King Charles III. It is quite well known that the current ruler of England was diagnosed with cancer earlier this year on February 5th. Like I said, he was photographed leaving the hospital after his first treatment for the illness. What's not known to the public is what kind of cancer the king has and at what stage. While there has been much speculation from the public regarding this information, the only information the castle released on the matter was that 1. He had it, and 2, it's not prostate related. The only other clue we really have is that the king has postponed all of his public obligations that involve showing face. The public are seriously concerned that the king's rule might not make it to the end of the year, wondering if the true reason for the lack of information shared is due to the fact that the king is terminal and wishes to grieve with his family before any official statement is released.
Alright, this next one is gonna sound pretty nuts. But there actually is some truth to this, that King Charles is a vampire. Now, is this just a nutty conspiracy theory, like the royal family are all secret demonic creatures feasting on human remains they keep locked away in dungeons under the palace? Well, there are 100% people who think that, but this is more to do with King Charles's ties to Romania. Not only does he own property there, but he's also related to Vlad Tepes, aka Vlad the Impaler, the brutal Romanian ruler who became the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. Vlad is technically Charles's great-grandfather, 16 times removed through Queen Mary of Teck, who was the consort of George V, Queen Elizabeth II's grandfather.
Circling back to the king's illness for a moment, if he were to pass at some point in the year, the most likely scenario of course would be that Prince William and Princess Kate would step into the role of king and queen consort. Many people believe that the preparations for this scenario are already well underway, and that the succession might be taking place much sooner than we think. This is also another explanation for Princess Kate's disappearance, as it is possible that the surgery was a complete facade, and instead she is working behind the scenes to help orchestrate a smooth transition for her husband William as he prepares for his role as king. According to insiders at the castle, these preparations are being held like cards at a high-stakes poker game close to the chest, as the king does not want William's younger brother Harry to be privy to any of the top-secret succession conversations.
So it's not just Princess Margaret that's said to have possibly had a secret child, but Charles and Diana as well. Only they hadn't intended for this to happen. This story is pretty wacky. And if this is actually true, like, there needs to be a movie made about this. Like, it sounds like something you'd read in a comic book rather than a real thing that you'd actually read about in the news having happened, but alright. Before marrying Prince Charles, Diana had a medical checkup to make sure she could get pregnant. Apparently, during this examination, a doctor swiped some of Diana's eggs, without her permission of course, and used in vitro fertilization to combine them with Prince Charles's seed, and then the embryo was implanted into the doctor's wife for her to carry. She then gave birth to Sarah in 1981, just after Charles and Diana's royal wedding. Now, there are images of Sarah, and the resemblance to Prince Diana is pretty uncanny. Here's a side-by-side. What do you all think of that? Possible? Yeah, possible.
Now, we've all heard the rumors that King Charles cheated on Diana back in the day with Queen Consort Camilla, which he probably did, but that's besides the point. It seems the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, as there have been numerous allegations claiming that Prince William has been following in his father's alleged footsteps, and that he and Kate might be headed for divorce because of it. Another possible reason for the princess's disappearance. Maybe she decided to run off with Pete Davidson as revenge. Anyways, the cheating allegations first began to circulate after William had been accused of stepping outside of his marriage with Kate in 2018 while she was pregnant with the pair's third child with a woman named Rose Hanbury. In another instance, a year prior, William had been seen placing his arms seductively around the waist of a mystery woman after ditching a Commonwealth Day service in favor of partying at a nightclub. Kate stated that she was less than pleased with the behavior he displayed while she was at home taking care of their kids.
Alright, and finally, we have the Illuminati connection. If your life was on the line and you were tasked with pointing to one family who is definitely part of the Illuminati, I mean, the royal family would be a pretty safe guess to make. There are kinds of out there conspiracy theories about the royals, but they all kind of center around the idea that they're part of some dark cabal pulling the strings behind the scenes of some of the biggest world events. And kind of in line with the whole vampire thing, there's of course the very real possibility that the royals aren't even human at all, but a bunch of lizard creatures, either from space or deep beneath the earth wearing human disguises. Just ask David Icke, the renowned author who's penned some of the greatest books in literature, with titles like Children of the Matrix, How an Interdimensional Race Has Controlled the World for Thousands of Years, and still does, I Am Me, I Am Free, The Robot's Guide to Freedom, Tales from the Time Loop, the most comprehensive expose of the global conspiracy ever written, and all you need to know to be truly free. And many, many more. Yep, this guy's got all the answers.
In our number 5 spot today, we have Boy Jones. Okay, I've heard of people being called Boy Jones before, but little did I know Boy Jones was a very real and very creepy person. His full name was Edward Jones, and this little rascal basically stalked the Queen from 1838 to 1841. He managed to break into Buckingham Palace, and we aren't just talking about once. No, we are talking about many, many times. He knew exactly where to go and what to do, and once in the castle, he would hide under the Queen's sofa, he would sit on her throne, and worst of all, he would go through her clothing. Like, what a little creep. He even went as far as to steal her clothes, which is just stupid. Of course, taking evidence of your crimes is just bad practice. Thankfully, he did finally get caught, but man, a few years of sneaking in and sitting on the throne, That's crazy. In our number 4 spot today, we have messy relationships. Joan of Kent lived during the 14th century in England, and she was known as being one of the most beautiful women in all of England. She was said to be quite loving, but it is also said that she had quite a whirlwind and controversial love life. So basically, Joan was only 12 when she had her first marriage. I know, horrifying now, but as was the practice at the time. She married a knight named Tom Holland, but when Tom went to war, Joan was approached by another man, the son of the Earl of Salisbury, who asked for her hand in marriage. Despite the whole Tom situation, she said yes, because at this time there was no way for anyone to know who would be coming back from battle, and she just assumed that Tom had died. It was of course quite the shock to everyone when Tom ended up returning, very much alive, to find out about all of this. A legal battle followed, which Tom ended up winning, and him and Joan went on to raise 4 children. After Tom's passing, however, Joan would go on to marry again, to the dismay of many people. This time she would marry the son of King Edward III, and she went on to become the first Princess of Wales. In our number 3 spot today, we have royal affairs. There have been many rumors over the years about the British royal family and their extramarital affairs, and I'm saying that this goes way back. So far back that one of the first accusations of this within the royal family dates all the way back to King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Since then, it has only continued with people such as Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend, Princess Anne and Commander Timothy Lawrence, and of course, Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, just to name a few. The latter of those definitely being the most famous, especially when Prince Charles was confronted about it by his wife at the time, the beloved Princess Diana. Apparently, Charles responded to the confrontation by saying, quote, "Well, I refuse to be the only Prince of Wales who never had a mistress." Maybe not the attitude to keep when speaking to your wife who you're cheating on. I don't know, just a thought. In our number 2 spot today, we have Prince John. This one is said to possibly be one of the darkest secrets of the British royal family. Prince John would have been the uncle of Queen Elizabeth II, but he passed before she was born. Prince John was the 6th child of King George V and Queen Mary, and it is said that he suffered from seizures, likely as a result of epilepsy, although it's hard to diagnose for certain because of all of the secrecy surrounding him and his illness. From the age of 4, when he had his first seizure, until his untimely and early death, Prince John lived in a separate estate where he was cared for by a governess. Many people have since criticized the royal family, calling their treatment of Prince John as callous or inhumane, like they were hiding him away for being ill. Of course, the palace was concerned with the monarchy's public image, and there was a belief at the time that royals shouldn't have any physical or mental ailments, although that of course is impossible. They also didn't include him in public events, which could have been another image thing, and also perhaps because of a worry that he might have a seizure at one of these events. At the end of the day, it was definitely a different time, but the idea of excluding him because he was ill truly is a very sad thought. In our number 1 spot today, we have the flag at half-mast. It is normal for a flag to be flown at half-mast following a great tragedy, so this certainly is not a dark tradition that the royal family has, but it's the time that they did not do this that is dark that I want to talk about today. After Princess Diana's death, people everywhere began mourning the loss, especially considering how young she was and how it all happened so quickly and unexpectedly. But the crazy thing, or I guess when you really think about it, the potentially sinister thing about it, is that the royal family just continued on as if nothing happened. Of course, business still needs to be conducted at times despite grief, but for many of them, there simply was no grief. The flag at Kensington Palace wasn't lowered to half-mast until the people complained about it, because they obviously felt like it was a slight to the princess. There were no public statements made until a day before her funeral, and there were many people who believed that if no one spoke up about this, that there may have never been any action taken by the family at all.
We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the inappropriate Christmas family photo. Take a look at this photo. How incredibly inappropriate and creepy. Like, you got the dad calling his 2 daughters hoes. I mean, it's a little funny, but it's very creepy. Like, whose idea was this? Also, what is that man doing with his wife's head? He's got like a claw hand on top of her. Is he trying to like hold her down? Also, no one in the photo looks like they're really enjoying this photo shoot. So I'll ask this again. Whose idea was this? I'd be mortified if I got this in the mail from any of my relatives. In our 4th spot, we have the ornaments. Whoever thought this next photo was a good idea needs to be fired. So this family went in for a cute Christmas photo shoot and then got edited as Christmas ornaments. Not gonna lie though, they all seem pretty happy, so maybe this is what they wanted. Like, it's kind of cute, but also they kind of look like Oompa Loompas. I bet this family looks back at this photo and they're like, what were we thinking? It's definitely coming back to haunt them. Like, people could use this photo as blackmail. I'm just kidding. It's not that bad compared to others on this list. It's more just like tacky than anything. Moving on to number 3, we have Dad's legs. Whoever posed this family in the photo needs to be fired. They literally were like, okay, let's have you hugging your parents, and let's have the 2 oldest boys sitting cross-legged on the floor hugging their parents' legs. Yes, perfect, it looks great. Really captures their innocence. No, it's a little creepy, if you ask me. Like, the matching outfits are bad enough. The pose just pushes it over the top. It's actually hilarious. Like, look at the dad's Superman pose. He's so proud, like, yeah, this is my family. So regardless of the cringe factor, it kinda is cute. Just not a photo you should have framed and hanging in your home. Coming in at number 2, we have the, I honestly don't even know what to name this one. Just take a look. I don't know. They look like a lotus flower or something. Anyways, how the photographer managed to keep a straight face as the family stacked on top of each other and just spread their legs wide open is beyond me. But at the same time, it's impressive. Like, look how flexible they all are. Also, it's pretty trippy. Like, whose arms are whose? Whose legs are whose? It's a little mesmerizing, you know? Like, the longer you look at it, the more you get intrigued. But I bet that baby is haunted by this photo now. And in our number 1 spot today, we have What the Heck Is This? And I gave this point that name because when I saw the photos, I literally said, what the heck is this? So 4 years ago, Pam Zaring and her family got some photos done. They hired a photographer who claimed to be a professional, and she charged them $250 for a family photo shoot. And this is what they were given. Pam and her family actually found these photos so hilarious that she actually tweeted them out, and they went viral. She said, and I quote, "This is not a joke. We paid a photographer who claimed to be a professional $2 to $250 for a family photo shoot. Please see these for real photos she delivered to us." She said the shadows were really bad on the beautiful, clear, sunny day, and that her professor never taught her to retouch photos. Feel free to share. I literally have not laughed this hard in years. You can't make this stuff up. End of quote. Again, these photos were not a joke. They were the final product. And honestly, the shadows on the face were probably better than her removing their face completely and then making them look like aliens. Like, I can't believe the photographer really edited these and thought, perfect, much better. Yeah.
Next up, we have the Church of the Lamb of God. Yeah, all these names are very similar. It's always the Church of the Solar something, the Temple of the something something, the Chicken Whackers. This creepy cult was led by a man named Ervil LeBaron. Ervil, spelled E-R-V-I-L. Never has a first name been so close to being 100% accurate. Just take that R out of there. Like pretty much every cult leader in history, LeBaron believed he was a prophet and claimed to receive divine revelations. But these revelations often led to violent actions against those he deemed as enemies or rivals. Now, under his leadership, the Church of the Lamb of God became a dangerous cult with members willing to kill at his command. They carried out attacks on perceived threats, including other religious leaders and mostly former followers who dared to speak out against the mighty LeBaron. But on June 1st of 1979, LeBaron was arrested. Now, even while in prison though, his reign of terror continued. He wrote a 400-page Bible known as the Book of the New Covenant, which included a hit list of targets that his followers were to take out. On June 27th, 1988, at exactly 4 p.m., 3 of LeBaron's former followers were killed all at once, all in separate locations. But in total, about 25 people were killed as a result of LeBaron's prison cell orders at later dates. And there are still former members in hiding to this day, still afraid that they'll be taken out by the few remaining members of the cult.
Next up, we have Matamoros, a cult rooted in illicit substances And human sacrifice? Well, it was half cult, half the psychotic rationalization of substance dealers. The organization was discovered in 1989 when authorities found the bodies of 12 men buried on a ranch in Mexico near the United States border, and 3 more later in another location. 3 men were implicated in the killing who, when arrested, claimed that the 15 deceased individuals had not been killed, but rather sacrificed in a ritual they believed would provide protection to their substance smuggling operation. They were wrong. But when police dove further into the operation, they realized that it was in fact a cult, and a satanic one at that, led by Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo and Sarah Aldrate, who was referred to by disciples simply as the Witch. When the pair learned that their organization had been infiltrated by authorities, they fled with a few of their followers. While on the run, Costanzo instructed one of his followers to kill him and then himself. When police finally caught up to the group, Costanzo, along with his disciple, were dead, and Aldrate, aka the Witch, was arrested and sentenced to 62 years in prison for her crimes.
Probably all heard of the True Russian Orthodox Church. I've talked about them a couple times before. Well, this is another Russian cult that lived underground. This one might be even creepier. A man named You know what? I'm not even trying to pronounce his name. Editor, just put it right on the screen. Come on, I'm not Russian. Anyway, he led a secretive cult in Russia where around 70 people, most of them underage, lived underground in catacombs. And not just for a month or two, this had been going on for a long time. Some of them had never even seen daylight before, which is nuts. Sattarov claimed he was Allah's messenger on Earth, and his followers believed him. The cult was discovered by authorities in August of 2012 during a routine check of Muslim communities near Kazan. When authorities found them, many were sick, suffering from poor ventilation. Some even had tuberculosis, apparently. And Sattarov's home, which was built above the underground complex, had also been built illegally, so it was to be demolished. And a bunch of the cult members were ready to defend their leader's home, threatening to throw themselves in front of construction machinery when the police tried to demolish it. They did end up demolishing it, though.
And finally, we have the Davidians, led by, get this, David. I'm no doctor, but it sounds like this guy's a bit of a narcissist. In 1987, David Koresh took what was once a Seventh-day Adventist religious group and turned it into a doomsday cult. Fun stuff. By 1993, the group had taken over and were living in a compound known as the Mount Carmel Center, located in Wacko, Texas. And boy, were they wacko. The center is where they prepared for the world's end and the second coming of Christ, which David Koresh told his followers would likely come sooner than expected. During this time, David also procured himself many, what he called spiritual wives, who he would regularly engage in adult activities with, and many of whom were quite young. It is also believed that by this time the group had been stockpiling weapons in preparation for Armageddon, or more likely in the event that the government tried to shut them down, which the government did try twice. The first infiltration attempt took place in early 1993. Police obtained search warrants for the compound as well as an arrest warrant for David and some of his followers, but David had been alerted of the authorities' arrival, and so he was ready, if you know what I mean. The result, 4 officers and 8 Davidians dead. After that, the FBI stepped in, but it appears as though David had had enough of the back and forth, and as soon as the FBI made their first move, launching a tear gas canister into the compound, members of the cult set the place on fire, causing the deaths of 76 Davidians, including David Koresh himself.
Next, we are talking about the Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, and they were not just gangsters. They were celebrities of the criminal underworld in the East End of London during the swinging 50s and 60s. These twins ran their gang called The Firm, with a mix of brutal violence and a surprising dash of charm, pulling off armed robberies, running protection rackets, and setting the occasional building on fire when needed. But the Krays weren't just about the tough stuff. They rubbed elbows with politicians and pop stars, making them the feared yet fascinating faces of London's mob scene. Their story is an absolute wild ride, complete with evil crimes, glamorous parties, and a dramatic downfall that turned them into legends. Everyone knew that crossing the Krays was a one-way ticket to trouble, but it is said that their charisma made them oddly magnetic figures in London's tumultuous underbelly. Next, we are talking about the Bourgeois family. This family is like the original Game of Thrones cast, full of plots, poison, and power grabs. During the Renaissance, they were like the Kardashians of their day, but way more dangerous. Rodrigo Bourgeois, who wormed his way into becoming Pope Alexander VI, was the family's superstar. Under his rule, the Vatican was less about piety and more about power plays and partying. His son Caesar was the real-life version of Machiavelli's prince, ruthless, cunning, and a master manipulator who inspired fear and respect. And then there's Lucretia, often painted as the femme fatale of the family, wrapped up in rumors of poison rings and scandalous affairs, but also a savvy political figure in her own right. Together, they turned the church and European politics into their personal chess game, leaving a trail of intrigue, mysterious deaths, and whispered secrets that make them one of history's most notorious and fascinating families. And finally, to close out our list today, we are talking about the Sonny Bean family. You would think that a family called the Beans would be like cute and nice and wholesome, like we're the Beans, but no, of course not. It simply just has to be the stuff of nightmares. The chilling saga of the Sonny Bean family is a tale that definitely straddles the murky line between Scottish folklore and nightmarish reality. So let's take it back to the 16th century on the rugged Scottish coastlines, where a secretive clan led by the infamous Sonny Bean resides. According to legend, this family wasn't your typical band of misfits, they were human eaters. Hiding out in a secluded coastal cave, the Bean clan supposedly ambushed unsuspecting travelers at night, dragging them back to their grim abode to meet a gruesome end. The stories claim that they took the lives of and feasted on over 1,000 people, thriving in secrecy for decades. Historians, however, are a little skeptical. I'm not here to lie to you. They poke holes in the tale, questioning its authenticity and suggesting it might be more about sensationalism than historical fact. But whether myth or fact, the story of the Bean family has fascinated and horrified people for generations, making it a perfect blend of horror and historical mystery. So, was Sonny Bean a real figure of terror, or just a boogeyman born from the depths of folklore? The answer might depend on how dark you like your history served.
To us from a now deleted Reddit user, and if this is true, it's absolutely nuts. So it goes like this. My uncle was working near Vancouver on a farm. He had been working there for a while, while my dad worked on a different farm not too far away. Well, the guy my uncle worked for had a bunch of pigs, and would often have pig roasts and invite a bunch of people over. He would also sell the pork to people in nearby towns. Well, at the same time, a bunch of women were going missing. After a while, my uncle left and didn't speak to the man again. Turns out, the farmer had killed 49 women and fed them to his pigs. He'd also mixed them with the pork that he sold. So basically, my uncle and many people were unknowingly eating people. End of post. So there was a very real case where this happened. Robert Pickton's the man. We've talked about him before on the channel. One of the most disgusting serial killers in history. So, if this Redditor's story is true, his uncle knew the guy, and not only that, he may have eaten human remains on more than one occasion. That is crazy.
The first time Charlie Brandt ever claimed a life was in January of 1971. He was young and filled with rage. In a fit of violence, he claimed the life of his mother and attempted to claim the life of his father by firing a weapon at both of them multiple times. He would have taken the life of his sister too, but his weapon jammed and she was able to fight him off. While you'd think this would be the end of the story, it unfortunately isn't. Because of Charlie Brandt's age, prosecutors declined to charge him, and eventually he, his father, and his sister just decided to put the incident behind them, which is probably the dumbest thing I've heard all year, and they went about their lives like nothing had happened. In 2004, Brandt and his wife Terry were staying with Terry's niece Michelle in Orlando, which is when, in an act of unprovoked violence, Brandt impaled his wife several times in the chest before moving on to attack Michelle. After he was satisfied and positive that both Terry and Michelle were dead, he took his own life. After his death, police linked Brandt to the 1989 killing of a woman named Sherry Parisho, and while he has not yet been linked to the death of any others, police are incredibly inclined to believe that Brandt's hit list is a lot longer in real life than it is on paper.
Fred and Rose West were a British couple who, on the surface, seemed like any other suburban family. I mean, looking at this photo, would you ever think they were responsible for a string of heinous, sickening, disturbing crimes? Fred, maybe, he kind of has that sinister grin, but Rose, she looks like a sweet librarian or a school teacher. But in this case, she was just as involved in the crimes as her husband was. Behind their seemingly normal public image was a house of horrors, and the couple would begin being investigated in 1992. Neighbors and friends saw them as an average couple, raising their family, running a business. To the outside world, they were just another hard-working family, but the reality was far more sinister. The Wests were involved in a series of horrific crimes, including the killings of several young women who would endure horrendous torment beforehand, and they'd hide their remains in the cellar or the garden. In 1994, police were investigating the disappearance of their daughter, Heather. What police were not expecting to find were numerous bodies buried around their property. The couple were arrested and charged. Fred took his own life in 1995, and Rose is still rotting away in prison where she belongs.
In 1893, John List, a former military man, moved into a massive mansion in Westfield, New Jersey, accompanied by his mother, his wife Helen, their daughter Patricia, and their sons Frederick and John Jr. For a while, they lived happily, but by November of 1971, things had taken a serious turn for the worst. John, who had already been experiencing some pretty severe financial difficulties, lost his job, and he snapped. While his daughter and sons were out of the house, he took the life of his mother and his wife. When his daughter Patricia and his son Frederick arrived home, he took their lives too. And then he stopped to make some lunch. After finishing up in the kitchen, he drove away from his home, picked up his remaining son John Jr., took him back to the home, and, as you can probably guess, took his life too. After that, he placed the bodies of his wife, his daughter, and his two sons in sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom. He left his mother in her room in the attic, and then he skipped town. In 1989, John remarried, and in 1990, he confessed to his crime, saying that he had only killed his family because he believed it was better to send them to heaven rather than have them share in his financial hardships, a sentiment shared by absolutely no one. For his crimes, John List was given 5 consecutive life sentences, although in the end, he only spent about 18 years in prison, the same number of years it took to catch him, because he died in his cell on March 21st of 2008 at the age of 82.
The Monniers were a very wealthy family living in Poitiers, France. They were of noble origin, they were well respected and happy. But in 1876, everything changed. Louise Monnier's daughter, Blanche, had gone missing. She and Blanche's older brother, Marcel, were incredibly worried. None of her friends knew where she was. She never left a note. It was as if she'd just vanished into thin air. 25 years passed, and then there was no sign of Blanche, and Marcel and Louise had more or less accepted that they'd never see her again. In May of 1901, the Paris Attorney General received an anonymous letter, though, reading, "Monsieur Attorney General, I have the honor to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house, half-starved and living on a putrid litter for the past 25 years. In a word, in her own filth." When police went to investigate, what they found was, shockingly, exactly what was detailed in the letter. An emaciated woman locked up in a small room where she'd been for the last 25 years. Blanche Monnier. She'd been locked away by her very own mother, and Marcel knew about it as well. But why? Well, it was all because Blanche had wanted to marry a man that the rest of the family didn't approve of.
Well, next we are talking about the Moran family. They were central figures in the gritty and blood-soaked drama of Melbourne's Gangland Wars, a series of brutal conflicts that rocked Australia's underworld in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Led by the tough-as-nails patriarch Louis Moran and his sons Mark and Jason, this family was deeply entrenched in the drug trade, living a life that mixed the glamour of big money with the grim reality of urban warfare. Their world was one where loyalty loyalty was under constant test and where any moment could erupt into violence, often leading to gruesome crimes as a tool for solving disputes and silencing rivals. The Moran's saga of crime and retribution didn't just make headlines, it actually inspired the hit TV series Underbelly, which really pulled back the curtain on their lives with a mix of true events and also a little dramatic flair. This show gave viewers a front row seat to the high stakes and fatal twists of Melbourne's criminal depths, portraying the Morans not just as cold-hearted gangsters, but as complex characters navigating a deadly game. Their story is a chilling reminder of how deeply crime can run in a family and how it can spiral out into a community, leaving a legacy of fear and fascination in its wake. Next, we are talking about the Gucci family. While not criminally evil in like the traditional sense, like maybe some of the others we've spoken about today, the Gucci family's saga reads like a script from a dramatic, high-fashion thriller complete with betrayal, opulence, and a dash of cold-blooded crime. This illustrious Italian family, known worldwide for their luxury fashion brand, has found themselves in the headlines for far more sinister reasons. Maurizio Gucci, the charming but embattled grandson of the founder Guccio Gucci, met a tragic end in 1995 when he was gunned down in Milan. The mastermind behind his killing was none other than his glamorous ex-wife, Patrizia Reggiani, who was dubbed the Black Widow by the press. She hired a hitman to kill Maurizio after their divorce, reportedly unhappy with his handling of the family fortune and his plans to marry another woman. This shocking act was the culmination of years of family infighting and luxury living gone awry, where the quest for control and the Gucci empire led to a series of disputes, legal battles, and financial missteps. As the Gucci family's dirty laundry aired in public, the world watched a real-life drama that overshadowed the brand's glossy image, showing that even in the world of high fashion, the price of greed and heartbreak can definitely be deadly. And finally on our list today, we are talking about the House of Habsburg. This was like the ultimate European royal powerhouse, ruling over the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Austria for hundreds of years. They were super influential, but they had a very strange way of keeping power within the family. They just married their own cousins. Lots of intermarriage to keep the dynasty pure, but this led to some very serious problems. The most notorious was the Habsburg jaw, a jutting jawline that was so pronounced in some family members that they had trouble speaking and eating. The most extreme case was Charles II of Spain, a guy whose health and mental abilities were so affected by these genetic issues that his reign is often cited as a major factor in the decline of the Spanish Empire. He was known as the Bewitched because of his various ailments and how they affected his rule. The poor guy's health was a total mess, and since he couldn't produce an heir, his death marked the end of the Habsburg line in Spain. This whole entire saga shows how the Habsburgs' obsession with keeping it in the family led to their downfall, turning them into a textbook example of why genetic diversity matters, especially if you're running an empire.
Richard Beasley used Craigslist to lure victims and commit a series of brutal crimes. He became known as the Craigslist Killer, and his daughter Tanya has had to live with the fact that her very own father was the man responsible for it all. In an episode of A&E's Monster in My Family, once again, Tonya spoke about her feelings of guilt. She shared a particularly disturbing memory. For the longest time, I just felt guilty because one of the last times I actually spoke with my father, he asked me to make him a Craigslist account. Maybe had I not even had the connection that we did have or the desire to help do even small things like that, then maybe it wouldn't have happened. And among that personal guilt is also the fear. I don't want anyone to blame me. Now, obviously, none of what happened was her fault. She had no way of knowing her dad was this complete monster, but just imagine having to grapple with that guilt, feeling like you'd inadvertently assisted in your parents' criminal activity. Just a nightmare. Edward Wayne Edwards led a truly terrifying double life. For decades, he was a man who blended into society, working odd jobs, appearing like any other ordinary guy, but in reality he was a ruthless serial killer. His daughter April Velasquez was the one who blew the lid off his secret life. In 2009, she told police about her growing suspicions that her father was involved in the killings of Timothy Hack and Kelly Drew, a young man and woman who'd gone missing in 1980. Her gut feeling came from the strange circumstances surrounding the cases and this unsettling pattern of violence that seemed to follow their family wherever they went. April recalled how she always felt something was off, saying, quote, "There were dead bodies. Someone was always killed wherever we lived." Despite her fears though, she clung to the hope that her father was just a grumpy old man and not the monster she was growing to suspect. But sadly, her suspicions were warranted, and the reality hit her hard. She described the moment she finally learned the truth, saying, "I literally went into a panic or an anxiety attack, had to pull off the side of the road, and that's when it really hit me that all the suspicions I had about my father were true, and that he was this monster." So far we've looked mostly at the black sheep of the family, but how about an entire household of bad eggs? The Bender family ran a small inn and general store in Kansas in the 1870s. To their neighbors and travelers, they appeared to be friendly, hard-working folk, and that was true. It's just that they had an added hobby of killing their visitors. The Benders used their inn as a cover for their gruesome crimes. They would lure unsuspecting travelers to their deaths, robbing and killing them before disposing of their bodies. A lot of the time they'd also sell all their stolen goods. Their inn became infamous as the site where numerous people seemed to vanish without a trace. Their crimes were discovered in the early 1880s, but as for the fate of the Benders, there's some debate on that. Some stories go that they were apprehended, killed by a mob, or possibly even escaped. Gary Ridgway, infamously known as the Green River Killer, was responsible for the deaths of 49 women in Washington state, dumping most of them near the Green River, and for years he managed to blend in and live what seemed like an ordinary life. To his son Matthew, he was just a regular dad. Despite not being around all the time because of a divorce, Ridgway made sure to show up for important events like soccer games and even taught Matthew how to ride a bike. In a 2003 interview, Matthew talked about how his dad seemed like any other parent. He had no idea about the horrific crimes his father was committing. It's chilling to learn that Ridgway would even use photos of his son or show off his son's bedroom to put his victims at ease, pretending to be this caring father that he appeared to be. Matthew was serving as a Marine at Camp Pendleton when his father was arrested. He was living in California at the time of his last public interview, trying to come to grips with the fact that his dad had this dark side completely hidden from him for years. Mikhail Popkov, also known as the Werewolf. Popkov, a former Russian policeman, was arrested for killing and mutilating several women, mostly escorts, between 1992 and 2000. After his arrest, his wife and daughter were adamant that he was innocent, even with this overwhelming evidence and his own confessions. They just refused to believe that the man they knew could be so evil. His daughter Katya was especially affected. She'd always seen her father as a loving, protective man. She said that she always felt safe with him. In 2015, she was interviewed and was still in denial. She was a school teacher, married, and expecting her first child though, and eventually started to come to terms with who her father really was, even consulting a psychiatrist about the possibility of her offspring inheriting any of her father's, quote, maniac traits.
Next, we are talking about Gerald and Charlene Gallego. Between 1978 and 1980, Sacramento, California was the hunting ground for a notorious couple who embarked on a terrifying crime spree, leaving a trail of horror behind them. Gerald and Charlene were a deadly duo who kidnapped women, turning them into their captives and subjecting them to unspeakable horrors before brutally ending their lives. In total, they claimed 10 innocent lives. Their reign of terror came to an abrupt end after a particularly bold kidnapping of Craig Miller and Mary Elizabeth Sowers, witnessed by the victim's friend, who quickly noted the van's license plate. Despite this, the evil couple managed to take the lives of Craig and Mary before the police could catch up. Gerald was sentenced to death in both California and Nevada, symbolizing the gravity of his crimes, while Charlene, turned informant, received a comparatively surprisingly lenient 16-year sentence, walking free in 1997. Gerald's life ended in prison due to rectal cancer in 2002, but the dark shadow of their deeds lingers in the memory of Sacramento to this day. Next, we are talking about David Allen Gore and Fred Waterfield. In the early 1980s, this duo, known as the Killing Cousins, unleashed a horrifying spree of violence against women. These two cousins were not just family, they were partners in a chilling series of gruesome crimes. They attacked their victims, dismembering their bodies and hiding them in unmarked graves. Gore, the more outspoken of the two, was found guilty of taking the lives of 6 women and definitely didn't hesitate to drag Waterfield into the nightmare, claiming he was involved in every attack. Despite this, Waterfield played the innocence card, bizarrely claiming that he was just a hostage in the whole situation. But the evidence, of course, stacked up against him, and while Gore faced execution in 2013, 30 years after their brutal crimes, Waterfield ended up with a life sentence behind bars. Next, we are talking about Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bueno Jr. Known as the Hillside Stranglers, these cousins were a chilling example of family ties turned toxic. These two turned the hills of Los Angeles into a nightmare landscape between 1977 and 1978, where they went on a crime spree that ended in taking the lives of 10 young women. What's particularly twisted is how they operated under the guise of police officers to lure their victims, showing a creepy level of cunning and manipulation. Their crimes, which originally threw investigators off by making them think a single person was behind them, revealed the dark potential of what can happen when family bonds are combined with a shared psychopathic streak. After their spree, the gruesome discoveries of the victims' bodies on the hillside sent shockwaves through the city, marking them as one of the most notorious pairs in American crime history. Bianchi tried to play the insanity card, but eventually both he and Buono were caught and convicted, proving that even the closest of family can't escape the long arm of the law when they spiral into such deep evil. Next, we are talking about the Fox sisters. These were 3 siblings from Rochester, New York, who sparked the entire spiritualism movement in the 19th century. Initially, young sisters Kate and Margaret Fox fooled people into believing that they could communicate with spirits using mysterious rappings. Their older sister Leah saw an opportunity and managed their careers, turning them into famous mediums. For years, they convinced many that they were channeling the dead, influencing a wave of spiritual belief across America. However, the spooky tale took a twist in 1888 when Margaret publicly admitted that it was all a hoax. She showed that the eerie sounds were actually made by just cracking their toe joints. Despite their confession, the fascination with spiritualism didn't die down. It actually continued to grow, showing just how eager people were to believe in the possibility of contacting the afterlife. The story of the Fox sisters is a fascinating mix of deceit, fame, and the human desire to find meaning beyond this world, wrapped up in a legacy that is still debated today. Their journey from small-town tricksters to founders of a major movement shows just how powerful and persuasive a well-spun tale can be, especially when it flirts a little with the unknown. And finally, on our list today, we are talking about the Wildenstein family. Renowned as powerhouse art dealers, the Wildensteins have been at the center of the art world for generations, known for their eye for priceless works and their knack for acquiring them. But it's not just all classy galleries and elegant auctions. This family has found themselves repeatedly in the hot seat for some pretty dodgy behavior. Accusations of fraud, theft, and massive tax evasion have clung to them like paint on a palette. They're like the art world's version of a heist movie, but instead of robbing banks, they're allegedly dodging taxes and swindling heirs out of their rightful inheritances. Their private lives are just as colorful and controversial. There's been messy public divorces that could rival any soap opera, with family members squabbling over their vast fortune. In one particularly juicy episode, a member of the family apparently tried to hide hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art from his estranged wife, leading to a scandal that had everyone from Paris to New York whispering over their champagne glasses. It's like they took the phrase family drama and decided to crank it up to an 11. With the Wildensteins, it's not just about selling art, it's about mastering the art of scandal.
Number 5.
the Benitez family. In 2013, Marie Jose Benitez and her daughter Allison, 19, mysteriously disappeared after a trip to Toulouse, France. They allegedly left after Marie Jose had an argument with her husband, Francisco. He told police that they turned their phones off when they got to town, and in order to give them space, he did not inform other family members where they had gone. But when police started investigating what happened to them, they quickly realized there was little evidence they had traveled at all. Neither had a driver's license, and there was no CCTV of them getting on or off a train. They also discovered neither women had made any calls to or from their cell phones, nor had they taken any money out of their bank accounts. After this, Francisco admitted to investigators that he and his wife were having marital issues, aka he cheated on her and she found out and she told her mother. In 2004, he was seeing a woman named Simone Oliveira Alves who had also mysteriously disappeared. Yeah, I think Francisco is the problem here. With all the similarities between the cases, police opened an investigation into Francisco, but within 2 weeks he was dead. He uploaded a video online proclaiming his innocence and then ended his own life. Forensic analysis found Allison's blood in the family freezer, but because their bodies were never found, the case has never been solved. Number 4. The Hyde family. In 1928, Bessie and Glenn Hyde were honeymooning in northern Arizona at the Grand Canyon when they vanished. They were traveling down the Colorado River by boat in October and planned to boat through the Grand Canyon. Glenn had run tough rivers before, but Bessie was new at it. The couple ran across other boaters a few weeks before their disappearance, who said they got the feeling that Bessie wanted to turn back, but Glenn was pushing her on. It was said if they completed the trip successfully, they could go on a paid lecture tour. So this trip was more than just fun, there was money at stake. Cut to several months later, the Hyde's boat was discovered that winter, seemingly undisturbed. It was upright and full of supplies, but the couple was gone. Now there are many theories about what happened to the Hydes. Did they disembark and try a too difficult side hike? Did they have an argument that turned violent? Or were they abducted? There are conflicting reports about what happened to the Hydes, and there has been more than one Bessie Hyde sighting in the years that followed. Number 3. Step-siblings. Step-siblings Chloe Leverett and Gage Daniel lived with their grandparents Leon Bubba and Molly McLaren in Unionville, Tennessee. The siblings were last seen at the home at 6:30 p.m. on September 23, 2012. At 9:30 p.m. the house caught fire and burned to the ground. Bubba and Molly were found dead inside, along with their pet dog and bird. Now despite a thorough search of the wreckage by authorities, no trace of the siblings were found. Authorities are not sure of what caused the fire, however the county sheriff believed that it was an accident. The McLarens had over 30 propane tanks in the basement, and fire officials found evidence that the tanks had ruptured, however there was no sign of an explosion. However, forensic anthropologists found no evidence to support this. To date, no one knows what really happened to them. Their mother Cheryl believes that they were kidnapped and that the fire was intentionally set. 1 year after the fire, a witness reported seeing Chloe at a restaurant and took a photo. Cheryl believes the girl in the photo is her daughter, however authorities were unable to track the girl down. Number 2. The Rogers family. By 1965, Charles Rogers was unemployed and living with his elderly parents, Fred Christopher and Edwina Ivor Rogers in Houston. Described as reclusive, Charles was reported to have communicated with his parents by a way of notes slipped under the door. Neighbors were unaware that Charles even lived with his parents, as he generally left the home before dawn and did not return until after dark. On June 23, 1965, 2 Houston police officers were dispatched to the Rogers home to conduct a welfare check after Edwina's nephew Marvin reported that his phone calls to his aunt had gone unanswered for days. After receiving no answer after knocking, the officers forced their way into the home. Upon entering, the officers found nothing unusual, but noticed food sitting on the dining room table. One officer opened the refrigerator and found what appeared to be numerous cuts of washed, unwrapped meat neatly stacked on the shelves. As the officer was closing the door though, he noticed 2 human heads visible through the clear glass of the vegetable bin. The heads were those of Fred and Edwina Rogers. What the officer initially thought were unwrapped cuts of hog meat were the couple's dismembered limbs and torsos. Police later discovered the couple's organs in a nearby sewer, while the other remains were never found. Now there was little blood in the house, and it appeared that it had been thoroughly cleaned, but what was found led to Charles's bedroom. There, police police found a blood-stained keyhole but saw no trace of Charles himself. A search for him was launched and a warrant was issued as a material witness to the crime, but he was never found. In 1975, a Houston judge declared Charles legally dead so his estate could be probated. The case still remains officially unsolved and Charles remains the only suspect. And coming at number 1 is the Shelton Brothers. The boys, Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner, spent the holiday with their father, John Skelton, in Marcini, Michigan in 2010. Their mother, Tanya Zovers, was supposed to pick them up from her ex-husband the next day. However, she stopped hearing from John, so she went to his house. He wasn't home because he was at the hospital after he broke his ankle. He told hospital workers that he injured his ankle while trying to end his life. Police were able to get into his home where they found the house destroyed, but the boys weren't there. John has been accused of changing the story of where they were while he was at the hospital. He said they were with friends before telling investigators that the boys were given to an unknown woman. He also told police that he gave them to an underground group that would keep them safe. Search parties looked for the boys, but they haven't been found, and John hasn't told anyone where they actually are or if they're even still alive, aside from his stories of giving them to unknown people. Well, that's all for our list of the top 10.
On the evening of August 17, 1993, a police officer in Salem, Oregon responded to a wellness call after an elderly couple, Richard and Grace Remy, hadn't answered their door. The officer entered the home to find both Richard and Grace dead. Shortly after, 2 young twins named Liddell and Lacelle White were arrested. Living nearby, they had a history of criminal behavior that included harassment, burglary, and SA. First, they were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, but because of their young age, the punishment was later deemed cruel and unusual, and they can apply for parole as early as 2048. On May 22nd of 1998, a man named Jack Wilson returned to his home in Huntsville, Alabama to find an intruder waiting for him. The intruder brutally attacked him with a baseball bat before jabbing him with a blade. A week later, a carpenter named James White was arrested and charged in connection with Jack's death. Shortly after, both Jack's wife, Betty Wilson, and her twin sister, Peggy Lowe, were also arrested. As the investigation unfolded, the attacker, James White, confessed that he was having an affair with Peggy, who was already married. Although Peggy didn't want anything to happen to her husband, she did tell James that her sister Betty was married to Jack Wilson and had apparently wanted something bad to happen to him so that he'd be out of the way. According to White, he was hired to handle the problem that was Jack, and claimed he was promised $2,500 up front and an additional $2,500 after the act was carried out. Both Betty and White were convicted and received life sentences. Peggy maintained her innocence though and argued that White was mentally unstable and that she hadn't even been having an affair with him. The Spahalski twins just could not stay out of trouble to save their lives. There's almost nothing these two didn't do. Stephen and Robert Spahalski grew up doing crimes together. By the time they were 18, they were doing armed robberies. One of these robberies went wrong, and Stephen ended up killing the store owner. He was sentenced to life in prison. But Robert's life didn't get any better now that he didn't have his partner in crime. In fact, it got way worse. He got into several illicit substances and started working in what's referred to as the oldest profession. Google that if you need to. Starting in 1973, he'd be in and out of prison for all sorts of things. And then starting in 1990, things got really bad. He killed a woman named Maureen Armstrong, a fellow worker of the night. A few months after that, he strangled his girlfriend. Then in 1991, he took the life of one of his male clients. It wasn't until 2005 that he'd kill again though, when he beat his girlfriend's neighbor to death after hallucinating that she'd turned into a demon. Obviously, he was not sober at the time. After sobering up though, he turned himself in, also confessing to the other killings years before. He received a 100-year prison sentence. The Carr brothers, Reginald and Jonathan, were responsible for a horrific crime spree in Wichita, Kansas in December of 2000. Over 6 days, they committed a series of violent acts that shocked the community. It all began on December 8th when they robbed a 23-year-old assistant baseball coach. This was just the start of the rampage though. 3 days later, on December 11th, the brothers escalated their crimes by fatally wounding a 55-year-old cellist during a carjacking. Their most disturbing act occurred on December 14th, though, when they broke into a home where 5 young adults were gathered. After robbing the house of valuables, they subjected the victims to horrific torment. The brothers forced them to withdraw money from ATMs, draining their bank accounts, and after that, they took the lives of the 5 victims at a secluded soccer complex on the outskirts of Wichita. Amazingly though, one of these victims, Holly G, managed to survive and later identified the brothers. The cars had fired at the back of their victims' heads, but a plastic hair clip Holly had been wearing deflected the bullet, and she survived. The Carr brothers were caught and are now on death row at the El Dorado Correctional Facility. In 2008, an argument between 2 brothers over inheritance money turned deadly. 50-year-old David P. Hett was found dead in his home in South Carolina by his friend. He'd received blunt force trauma to the head. He also had several defensive wounds on his arms and hands. Turned out his attacker had been his very own brother, Paul Richard Hett. Turned out they'd gotten into a heated argument over inheritance money, which quickly turned violent. Their mother had just died, leaving Paul with pretty much all her assets, and David just received $1. Ouch, I can see why an argument may have started there. With all that said though, I've been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.
Want to see more videos like this one? Check out this video next. This video is about real encounters with demons from the Bible that will leave you shaking from head to toe. Are you too scared to check it out? Click the video now. Viewer discretion is heavily advised.